The sun was a merciless, white-hot eye in the sky over Redemption Creek, Kansas. It had been like this for months, a relentless, unforgiving heat that turned the world to dust. John Cooper, his face a map of sun-worn lines and his hands calloused from years of toil, stood on his porch and looked out over his farm. The cornstalks, once a vibrant green promise, were now brittle, yellowed skeletons, rattling a mournful tune in the dry wind. The earth itself was cracked and broken, a web of deep fissures that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. Every morning, the despair felt a little heavier. John, a man in his late 30s who had inherited this land from his father, knew that he was staring at ruin. The savings were gone, the crops were failing, and the well was almost dry. The only thing that moved with purpose was his loyal border collie, Dusty, who chased a phantom jackrabbit across the parched field, kicking up a small cloud of dust. John wished he had a fraction of the dog's relentless energy. The town of Redemption Creek was a ghost of its former self. The general store was mostly empty, the saloon was quiet, and the church bells hadn't rung in weeks, as if even God had abandoned them. The only sound, a constant irritating reminder of the town's plight, was the creaking groan of a windmill on the neighboring farm. It belonged to Sarah Jenkins, a young widow with a small boy named Tommy. John watched her sometimes from afar, admiring her quiet resolve, the way she kept her head high despite the immense weight on her shoulders. Her windmill was the only one still turning, a lonely monument to a hope that was quickly fading. Just as the sun began its slow descent, a strange stillness fell over the valley. The wind, which had been a constant companion, suddenly died. John felt a chill, a deep sense of unease. Then, from Sarah's property, came a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a long, splintering groan, followed by a thunderous crash, the sound of hope shattering. Dusty, who had been panting at John's feet, suddenly began to bark wildly, a sharp, panicked sound. He bolted toward the sound of the crash, his tail high, his barking echoing off the hills. John, his heart pounding in his chest, followed. When he reached the Jenkins farm, he saw it. The massive wooden blades of the windmill lay in splinters on the ground, the tall iron tower bent and broken. A steady stream of liquid was pouring from a ruptured pipe, soaking into the dry soil. John's mind raced with despair for Sarah. This was it. This was the end for her farm, for everything she had fought so hard to keep. He looked up at her small cabin and saw her standing on the porch, holding her son, her face a mask of grief. John approached the wreckage, his boots sinking into the wet ground. The fluid was dark, almost black, and it had a strange sheen. It wasn't clear like water, it was thick and viscous, and it clung to the broken pieces of wood and pipe. He knelt down, scooping a handful of the liquid into his palm. It was cool and slick, and it had a faintly metallic, earthy smell. He wiped his hand on his trousers, a question forming in his mind. He had read stories, heard tales from far-off lands, but he had never believed them. This couldn't be, could it? His eyes went from the strange liquid to the jagged rupture in the iron pipe. This wasn't a well. It was a gash in the very earth itself, and what was coming out of it wasn't water. Dusty, still barking, nudged his hand. John looked at the dog, then back at the black fluid. A cold dread, mixed with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pure, unadulterated shock coursed through him. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the quiet figure of Sarah on her porch. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that what he had found in the wreckage of her windmill had the power to either destroy them or save them all. The moment John approached Sarah's porch, the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. He saw the tears on her cheeks, a river of pain mirroring the one flowing from the broken earth. He held out his oil-slicked hand, the dark liquid a stark contrast to her pale, frightened face. "Sarah, you have to see this," he said, his voice low and urgent. She didn't look at his hand. Her eyes were fixed on the splintered ruin of her windmill. "It's all gone, John. James built that with his own hands. And now Now it's just a pile of kindling. No, Sarah, listen to me, he insisted, stepping closer. This isn't just about the windmill, the pipe. It burst, but what's coming out isn't water. Her weary eyes finally met his, filled with a mix of confusion and anger. What are you talking about? It's the well. It's been drying up for months. Now it's nothing but mud. It's not mud. It's oil, he said, the words feeling foreign and monumental on his tongue. He led her off the porch and closer to the wreckage. Dusty trotted ahead, his nose sniffing the ground with an almost frantic energy. Sarah's son, Tommy, clung to her dress, his wide eyes full of questions. John knelt and pointed to the dark fluid pooling around the debris. Look, see how it glistens. It doesn't smell like anything, but it's thick. It's oil. I think the well pipe hit a pocket of it deep underground. This isn't just a spring, Sarah. It's a well of oil. Sarah knelt with him, her fingers tentatively touching the black liquid. She smeared it between her thumb and forefinger, her expression shifting from disbelief to a stunned realization. The tears returned, but this time they were different, filled with a fragile, dawning hope. Oil, she whispered. The word, a prayer, like the kind they talk about in Pennsylvania. I don't know, John admitted, but it's here, on your land. This could be everything. The two of them sat in the dusk, surrounded by the wreckage, the air still and heavy. The silence was no longer one of despair, but of immense possibility. They were no longer just two struggling farmers. They were the custodians of a secret that could either be their salvation or their damnation. They knew they couldn't keep it to themselves. This find was bigger than one farm, bigger than two broken people. It was a promise for the entire town. They had to tell the others. Word of the discovery spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. At first it was met with skepticism, a weary disbelief born of a long, dry season of broken promises. But when John and Sarah invited the townsfolk to the Jenkins farm and showed them the steady stream of oil seeping from the ground, the collective mood began to shift. The men, their faces etched with desperation, knelt and touched the dark fluid, their fingers tracing the lines of a future they hadn't dared to imagine. The women, who had been rationing food and water for months, looked at each other with wide, hopeful eyes. For the first time in over a year, there was a buzz of conversation in the dusty streets. John, thrust into the role of a leader he never sought, took control. "We can't sell this to a company," he said at a hastily called town meeting in the saloon, his voice a little hoarse from the dust. "They'll pay us a few dollars, strip the land and leave us with nothing. This belongs to all of us." Sarah stood beside him, her presence a quiet force. "We need to build a new well, a real one to get at the heart of it. We can work together, pool what we have left, and do it ourselves." A farmer named Old Man Jed, a grizzled veteran of the land, spoke up. "We ain't got the know-how, John. We're farmers, not roughnecks." "We'll learn," John said simply. "We have the land. We have the will. We'll find a way." And they did. The following weeks became a blur of communal effort. The blacksmith, a man named Silas, worked tirelessly to forge new tools and reinforce the broken pipe. The women, led by Sarah, organized a steady stream of food and water for the workers. The saloon owner, George, traded his best whiskey for manual labor. The children, for the first time, played games not of survival, but of construction, building miniature windmills out of sticks and string. John and Sarah spent every day together, working side by side. He was impressed by her resilience, her unwavering spirit. She saw in him a man of quiet strength, a natural leader who put the needs of others before his own. The dusty, oil-stained world they inhabited slowly became one of shared purpose. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, John saw her laughing as Tommy tried to pet Dusty, the dog's tail wagging a furious rhythm. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a revelation. In the midst of all the hard work and conflict, a fragile new kind of hope was taking root between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. The news of a successful oil find in Redemption Creek traveled far faster than the town's ability to prepare for it. The Vulture arrived in a sleek black carriage, cutting a stark figure against the dusty landscape. His name was Elias Thorne, a notorious oil baron from back east. Thorne was a man of impeccable taste and cold calculation, his suit spotless, his smile a chillingly polite mask. He found John and Sarah at the well site, directing the work. The scent of fresh oil hung in the air, a scent of money and power. Thorne's eyes, the color of cold steel, took in the makeshift rig, the determined faces of the townsfolk, and the pools of black gold. "Mr. Cooper, Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice a smooth, unsettling drawl. "My name is Elias Thorne. I've come to make you a very generous offer. I'll buy this land and everyone in town a new life." John stepped forward, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. "This isn't for sale, Mr. Thorne. This belongs to the town." Thorne's smile widened slightly, a predator's grin. "The town? My dear man, you're a collection of farmers. You don't have the capital, the expertise, or the manpower to drill a proper well. This little puddle of yours will dry up. I'll give you $10,000 for the entire valley. It's a fortune for a town like this. You could all move away and start fresh." Sarah, her hand on John's arm, spoke with quiet authority. "We've already started, and we're staying." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I'm a patient man, but not endlessly so. I'll give you a week to reconsider. After that, my offer will drop. You'd be wise to take the money and run, because I will have this land one way or another." He climbed back into his carriage and was gone, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The hope that had been so bright suddenly felt fragile. The townsfolk looked at John and Sarah, fear creeping back into their eyes. They had a shared purpose, but now they also had a shared enemy, one with seemingly unlimited power. John and Sarah knew they had to work faster, harder. Thorne's threat wasn't just to their well, it was a threat to their very existence. They had to build their fortress before the Vulture returned to claim his prize. The week that followed was a feverish race against time. The town, galvanized by Thorne's visit, worked with a new intensity. John, guided by a crude diagram he'd found in an old book, oversaw the construction of a proper derrick. The men, their hands blistered and their backs aching, learned to hoist heavy iron pipes and secure them with a precision born of desperate need. The communal spirit was at its peak. The women, in their kitchens, prepared huge pots of stew and baked bread, fueling the long hours of labor. Sarah was John's shadow, his partner in every sense of the word. She had a keen mind for logistics, organizing the supply runs and keeping a meticulous count of every nail and every bolt. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the work lights flickered, they would sit together, exhausted, sharing a cup of coffee. It was during these quiet moments that their unspoken affection began to take shape. One night, as a cool breeze finally swept through the valley, John looked at Sarah. The moonlight caught her face, softening the hard edges of exhaustion. "You're the strongest person I know, Sarah Jenkins," he said, his voice a low rumble. A faint smile touched her lips. "I've had to be. For Tommy. For more than that," he said, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "You've been a beacon for this whole town." She didn't pull away. Their hands stayed for a moment, a simple, comforting touch that said more than words ever could. It was a connection born from shared grief, and now shared hope. A love story forged in the dirt and the dust, as authentic and raw as the landscape around them. They both knew that this was a moment they couldn't rush, a feeling they had to protect as fiercely as their newfound well. They were building a fortress, not just against Thorne, but for the future they were quietly building together. As Thorne's deadline approached, his intimidation tactics began. Small things at first, a broken part, a stolen tool, a spilled barrel of precious oil. Then the acts grew bolder. A fire was set in the general store, quickly extinguished but leaving a palpable sense of fear. The townsfolk, their nerves frayed, began to look at each other with suspicion. Who among them could be working for Thorn? John and Sarah held another town meeting, the air thick with tension. Old man Jed, his face grim, spoke up. "We ain't built for this, John. We're farmers. Thorn's got more money than God, and he's not afraid to use it. Maybe we should just sell." The idea hung in the air, a poisonous temptation. John looked at the faces in the room, the fear in a mother's eyes, the defeat on a father's face. He knew he couldn't let them give in. "He's trying to break us," John said, his voice rising. "He wants us to turn on each other, but we're better than that. We're a community. We've worked too hard. We've come too far. We'll stand together." He looked at Sarah and she nodded, her eyes unwavering. "John's right," she said. "We have to trust each other. Thorn wants to buy our soul, not just our land." The words resonated. The fear didn't vanish, but it receded, replaced by a renewed resolve. The town became a watch station. Men took shifts guarding the well, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. John and Sarah tightened security, setting up alarms and keeping a close eye on any strangers. They knew Thorn was testing them, pushing them to their breaking point. But every act of sabotage, every whisper of fear, only strengthened their belief in what they were fighting for. This wasn't just a business venture. It was a fight for their home and their dignity. In the midst of the escalating conflict, the simple moments of human connection became more precious than ever. John and Sarah found solace in each other's company, their bond deepening as they faced the rising tide of fear and adversity. One night, after a long day of working and watching, they sat on her porch, the stars a brilliant, uncaring display in the inky sky. Tommy was asleep inside, and Dusty was a dark shape at their feet. The silence was comfortable, filled only with the faint sound of the wind and the distant crickets. "You know," Sarah said softly, her voice a gentle whisper, "when James passed, I thought that was it for me, for us. I thought I would just exist until the farm gave out. I didn't think I would ever feel hopeful again." John looked at her, his rugged face softened by the moonlight. "I know the feeling. After the drought hit, I was just going through the motions. Waking up, working, sleeping. There wasn't any point to it all." He turned to face her fully, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused fingers. "You gave me a point. You and Tommy and this town." She leaned into his touch, her eyes glistening. "And you, John, you gave us hope. You found this. You stood up for us. I don't know what we'd do without you." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken affection between them became a tangible, living thing. John leaned in, and his lips met hers in a tentative, tender kiss. It was a kiss not of passion, but of comfort, of shared burdens, of quiet promises for a future they were building from the ground up. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a union born of necessity and forged in resilience. In the Old West, love stories were rarely about grand gestures. They were about survival, about two people finding a safe harbor in each other, a place where they could finally put down their heavy loads and rest. For John and Sarah, that safe harbor was each other. The week had passed. Thorn's patience had run out. He arrived in town on a sun-drenched afternoon, not in a carriage, but on horseback, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men. They were not gentlemen like Thorn, but thugs, their faces hard and their eyes empty. They rode directly to the well site, a cloud of dust billowing behind them. The townsfolk, seeing them approach, gathered quickly, their fear replaced by a fierce collective defiance. John and Sarah stood at the center of the crowd, their hands linked, a silent sign of their unity. "My final offer," Thorn announced, his voice carrying an edge of ice. "I'll give you $5,000. Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, I'll take it anyway, and you'll get nothing but a fight you can't win." A murmur went through the crowd. Thorn's men dismounted, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. The tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating. John stepped forward, a solitary figure facing a small army. He wasn't a gunman or a hero. He was a farmer. "This isn't a business deal, Thorn," he said, his voice steady. This is our home. You can't put a price on that. Thorn laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Your home. This is a patch of worthless dirt, soon to be a sea of my oil. You're a fool, Cooper. Get out of my way. John didn't move. He stood his ground, a testament to the quiet strength he had discovered. Sarah was a step behind him, her hand still linked in his, a testament to their unbreakable bond. The townsfolk stood with them, their rifles and shotguns held high. They were outmatched, but they were not outmaneuvered. "We ain't moving," a man's voice called out from the crowd. "This is our town. Go back to where you came from." Thorn's smile vanished. "So be it," he snarled. He gave a signal to his men. The air was filled with the click of hammers being drawn back on pistols. This was it, the climax, the moment of truth. Just as Thorn's men began to advance, Dusty, the border collie, broke through the crowd. He wasn't barking. Instead, he was running in a frantic, wild circle, his focus on something behind Thorn's men. Dusty ran, then stopped, his tail wagging furiously as he began to dig at the ground. One of Thorn's men, irritated, kicked at the dog. But Dusty didn't stop. He barked once, a short, sharp cry. Then the ground beneath the thugs began to give way. The earth, softened by the leaking oil, had become a treacherous mire. The men, their heavy boots and polished leather, were sinking. Thorn, bewildered, watched as his men struggled. He looked at John, at the dog, and a cold, calculating understanding dawned on his face. The oil well wasn't the only pocket. The entire valley floor was a ticking time bomb. "You fools!" Thorn shrieked. "You're all standing on a bog. This whole valley is saturated with oil. One spark, one mistake, and you'll all be burned alive." The realization spread through the townsfolk like a shockwave. Thorn was right. They had been so focused on their prize, they hadn't seen the danger. The very thing that was meant to save them could be their ruin. They were standing on a land that could ignite at any moment. The fight with Thorn was over. The new, more terrifying fight had just begun. Thorn, in a moment of panic, ordered his remaining men to retreat. He had come for the land, but not at the cost of his own life. John, seeing the terror on his neighbors' faces, knew what he had to do. He stepped forward. "He's right," John said, his voice grave. "This oil is a risk. It's a risk we can't take. We have to seal it off, all of it." The townsfolk were stunned. They had worked so hard, fought so fiercely for this. To give it up now seemed impossible. "We'll find another way," John said, looking at Sarah, a silent promise in his eyes. "We'll be a community again, a real one, not a town built on a lie. We'll be a town built on each other." The battle was won, but the real work had just begun. Over the next several months, the townsfolk of Redemption Creek did what no one else would have done. They sealed the well, working with painstaking care to cap the flow of oil, to contain the danger. John and Sarah led the effort, their hands and faces stained with the same black substance that had promised them so much and almost taken everything. The land was still fertile once you dug past the oil-saturated topsoil, and they returned to their roots, to farming. But this time, it was different. John had an idea. He discovered that the deep fissures in the ground, once a sign of drought, were actually a source of a new, untapped water table. The oil had simply revealed it. With the townsfolk's help, he and Sarah developed a new, more efficient way to irrigate their crops, a system that used a windmill to draw up the water. The fields, once parched, began to turn green. The oil became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what they had almost lost. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek learned a powerful lesson. True wealth wasn't in the ground, but in the community itself. They had fought for something, not just against an outside force, but for their own soul. John and Sarah married in a small ceremony in front of the rebuilt windmill, a symbol of their shared past and their hopeful future. They had a child together, a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn spirit. Dusty, the loyal dog, was a constant companion, a hero in his own right. The town thrived, not with the wild, lawless boom of an oil town, but with the quiet, steady hum of a farming community. A place where neighbors helped neighbors, where the harvest was a shared triumph, and where the most valuable resource was not buried deep in the earth, but in the resilience of the human heart. John, the poor farmer, had followed his dog into a shattered windmill, and in its wreckage he found not just a source of fleeting wealth, but a path to a more meaningful, enduring kind of redemption.